The morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of the factory, striking the rows of stamping presses and conveyor belts that had once produced cars but now churned out tanks and armored vehicles. Mary Thompson wiped her brow as the machine roared to life beneath her hands, the rhythm of steel and sparks filling the cavernous hall. She had never imagined herself in a place like this, yet as she watched the tanks take shape, she felt a surge of pride. Every plate welded, every bolt fastened, was more than work. It was a contribution to something greater, a shield for soldiers thousands of miles away who would never see her face, but would owe her their lives. Outside, the streets were lined with banners urging citizens to buy war bonds and save scrap metal. Children carried baskets of tin and rubber, little victories that helped turn ordinary household items into planes and ships. Mary paused during her lunch break to glance at the ration books in her purse. Sugar was scarce, meat carefully measured, and gasoline tightly controlled. Families had learned to make do with less, to stretch each coupon, to turn a simple garden into a victory garden overflowing with tomatoes, beans, and carrots. Every bite eaten, every garden planted, every rationed meal became an act of patriotism. Across the city, Henry Rodriguez wiped sweat from his forehead as he welded the hull of a Liberty ship. The shipyards were alive with activity, men and women moving in a synchronized chaos that was almost beautiful in its precision. Henry, a Mexican-American, had grown up in a small farming town, and the roar of the welders and the hiss of steam presses felt alien, yet exhilarating. He looked around and saw women operating cranes, African Americans working alongside white men, all united by a shared urgency that blurred old lines of division. For the first time, skill and determination mattered more than background or skin color. And even as prejudice lingered, the war demanded that society stretch itself, just as it had stretched its factories and resources. In quiet homes, mothers clipped ration coupons and taught their children the new rules of wartime life. Fathers who had not yet enlisted repaired fences, tended gardens, or volunteered in bond drives. Even the simplest routines had shifted. Grocery lists were carefully planned, meals creatively prepared, and every purchase weighed against the needs of a nation at war. Neighbors shared recipes for sugarless cakes or meatless stews, turning necessity into community. The war had seeped into every corner of life, reshaping daily routines and forging bonds of shared responsibility. At night, the city streets hummed with a different kind of energy. Community centers hosted dances and fundraising events for soldiers overseas. Church halls filled with volunteers knitting socks, sewing uniforms, and preparing care packages. Teenagers collected scrap metal, rubber, and paper, learning early that heroism came in small, sustained acts rather than grand gestures. Families gathered around the radio to hear the latest news from the front. Listening to correspondents' voices bring the battles into their living rooms, triumphs and losses alike felt personal, and the war became a constant living presence in every home. Even the workforce shifted dramatically. Women, once expected to stay at home, now dominated factory floors and shipyards. Rosie the Riveter was no mere symbol. She was a reality, embodied by every woman who had mastered machinery, worked double shifts, and juggled childcare while sustaining the production lines that fueled the war. African Americans migrated north and west, filling jobs in steel mills, aircraft factories, and ordnance plants. Their presence challenged old norms, and while segregation and prejudice persisted, the wartime economy could not afford to ignore talent and skill. Social change was slow and uneven, but it was undeniable. In small towns, the war brought new rhythms to daily life. Victory gardens sprouted in backyards and schoolyards, children skipped rope while collecting cans, and local scrap drives became community events. Highways carried trucks laden with military supplies, and factories never rested, their smokestacks sending columns of white and gray into the sky. Even leisure was reframed. Families vacationed closer to home, citizens attended bond rallies instead of concerts, and every act of conservation was framed as a contribution to the collective effort. Through it all, the weight of responsibility pressed upon everyone. Yet a quiet pride underpinned their efforts. Mary and Henry, the mothers and fathers, the children and volunteers, understood that their work mattered. Each bolt welded, each rationed meal, each scrap collected was a thread in the larger tapestry of victory. They were the silent backbone of a nation at war, and though their names might never appear in history books, their impact was profound. As the war progressed, the American home front became a microcosm of both sacrifice and ingenuity. Women ran entire production lines, teenagers mastered complex technical tasks, and families adapted to shortages and rationing with resourcefulness. Neighborhoods became support networks, and even the simplest acts, growing a garden, knitting a sock, sending a letter, carried weight. The country had changed irrevocably during those years from 1941 to 1945. Citizens had learned that freedom demanded more than bravery on distant battlefields. It required participation, adaptation, and courage at home. When news finally came that the war was over, the celebrations were widespread, joyous, and deeply emotional. Streets overflowed with cheering crowds, flags waved in every direction, and children danced with abandon. Yet in quiet corners, factories grew still, ration books were set aside, and families slowly returned to routines reshaped forever. Mary, Henry, and millions of others understood that the home front had been a battlefield in its own way, one fought with ingenuity, resilience, and shared sacrifice. The war had demanded everything, and in response, a generation had risen to meet it. It was a legacy of endurance, creativity, and community, a testament to the quiet heroism of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. From the roar of the factories to the hush of victory gardens, from rationed kitchens to crowded shipyards, Americans had remade themselves in the crucible of war. The society that emerged in 1945 was transformed, not just by victory abroad, but by the courage, labor, and ingenuity of those who had fought, in ways large and small. On the home front, by 1943, the rhythm of wartime life had become relentless. Factories roared day and night, their smokestacks painting the skies with plumes of smoke that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Mary Thompson had grown accustomed to the pace, her hands calloused from months of welding and stamping steel, her ears perpetually ringing with the roar of machinery. Every tank she helped assemble carried the lives of soldiers into battle, and she understood that speed and precision were inseparable from survival. Across Detroit and other industrial cities, the same scene played out thousands of times. Women running cranes and presses, men learning new trades, and supervisors struggling to maintain efficiency amid exhaustion and tension. Yet the home front was not without friction. Labor strikes erupted in plants where workers demanded fair wages, safer conditions, or relief from impossible schedules. One afternoon, Mary watched a group of union representatives march past the factory gates, their banners declaring their grievances, while the management argued the urgency of production. Morale wavered as workers struggled to balance patriotism with fairness. Mary herself sympathized with the demands. Many had suffered injuries, long shifts, and relentless pressure. But she also understood that every delay could have consequences for soldiers overseas. Negotiations were tense, but eventually compromises were reached, demonstrating that even in times of national emergency, justice and rights could not be entirely suspended. Outside the factories, neighborhoods had transformed. Apartment buildings in Chicago and New York were crowded with new arrivals from the South and Midwest, drawn by job opportunities in steel mills and aircraft plants. The Great Migration accelerated as African Americans left farms and small towns in search of steady work, confronting discrimination even as they contributed vitally to the war effort. Mary's friend, Ruth, an African-American nurse who had moved north, often spoke of the dual struggle, fighting for a nation abroad while encountering prejudice at home. Yet she found pride in her work at a hospital, treating wounded soldiers returning from overseas, knowing that her service was part of the larger effort. Children became intimately familiar with the war, too. School curricula included lessons on rationing, scrap collection, and the importance of war bonds. After school, children ran errands for neighbors, collected tin and rubber, or helped tend gardens that would feed families and supplement rationed food. They learned that every act, however small, had significance. The war became woven into the fabric of childhood, shaping values of responsibility, resilience, and community. Even their play reflected the conflict. Games mimicked soldier maneuvers, improvised battles, and strategic planning, echoing the larger struggles happening thousands of miles away. At night, the neighborhoods buzzed with volunteer activity. Women gathered in church basements to knit socks for soldiers, men organized scrap drives, and teenagers helped stamp envelopes with letters of support and donations for bond drives. The sense of collective purpose was tangible. No one could escape the war's demands, yet in shared effort, Americans found pride and meaning. Communities that had once been ordinary now pulsed with energy, focus, and ingenuity. Mary sometimes marveled at the transformation, realizing that life had become both more complicated and more purposeful. Meanwhile, rationing continued to reshape domestic life. Gasoline was carefully allotted, with travel restricted to essential trips. Sugar, coffee, meat, and other staples were measured meticulously, and home cooks adapted to new recipes that made use of substitutions and shortages. Victory gardens became a source of not only sustenance, but also community pride, with neighbors comparing yields, swapping seedlings, and sharing knowledge. Even small acts, canning tomatoes, preserving beans, or baking bread without sugar, were imbued with patriotic significance. Every ration book coupon redeemed, every meal stretched, became a silent act of support for soldiers on the front lines. The war also accelerated social change. Women demonstrated their competence in roles traditionally reserved for men, often outpacing them in skill and efficiency. African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and other minority groups pressed for access to jobs and fair treatment, laying the groundwork for civil rights movements that would surge in the following decades. Mary, Ruth, Henry, and countless others realized that the home front was not just about production. It was about reshaping society, challenging norms, and forging a sense of shared purpose that transcended old divisions. Even as the demands grew heavier, Americans found moments of respite. Community dances, church socials, and bond rallies provided relief from the constant work. Radios broadcast news from the front lines, entertainment programs, and morale-boosting speeches that connected citizens to the larger struggle. Letters from soldiers arrived sporadically, treasured and read aloud at family tables, offering reminders of the stakes and the human faces behind the machinery of war. By the winter of 1944, the cumulative effect of mobilization was evident. Production numbers soared. Planes, tanks, ships, and munitions rolled out in staggering quantities. Families had adapted fully to rationing and resource conservation, neighborhoods had become cooperative networks, and society had shifted in ways both visible and subtle. Women had gained skills and independence, minorities had claimed new spaces in the workforce, and the collective American identity had strengthened around shared sacrifice. The nation had become a massive, coordinated effort, a home front that rivaled the front lines in importance and intensity. As Mary walked home through the snow-covered streets one evening, she paused to look at the glowing windows of factories still humming with activity. She thought of the soldiers overseas, the wounded in hospitals, and the families who had sent everything they could spare. She understood that every hour of labor, every rationed meal, Every scrap of metal collected and every bond purchased was part of a larger story of resilience and courage. The home front was a battlefield of its own, fought with determination, ingenuity, and sacrifice. And as the first news of victory in Europe filtered through the radio in early 1945, Mary and her fellow citizens understood that they had played a decisive role. The war had demanded everything from them, yet they had risen to meet it, transforming their lives, communities, and society in the process. The sacrifices had been immense, but the rewards, a sense of purpose, unity, and contribution to a greater cause, were profound and lasting. Spring of 1945 arrived with a strange mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. Factories still roared, though whispers of the war's imminent end filled the air, carried in the radio broadcasts and the hurried conversations of neighbors. Mary Thompson wiped grease from her hands and leaned against the stamping press, listening as the announcer detailed the Allied advance into Germany. Each report brought relief and a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that the hours she and her colleagues had spent working night shifts, welding armor, and assembling tanks had directly contributed to the successes on distant battlefields. In the neighborhoods, children ran through the streets, clutching scrap metal and tin, practicing the rhythms they had learned over years of collection drives. Victory gardens were already showing the first signs of spring, bursting with green shoots and the promise of a good harvest. Families compared yields and swapped seeds, teaching the younger generation lessons that went beyond gardening, lessons in cooperation, patience, and resilience. Even as the end of the war approached, Americans maintained their rhythm of contribution, knowing that victory required sustained effort until the final moments. Labor tensions persisted, though the stakes had changed. Strikes erupted in some cities as workers demanded recognition for their sacrifices, pay raises, or safer conditions, reminding everyone that even in times of national unity, fairness could not be ignored. Henry Rodriguez, now seasoned and respected in the shipyards, helped mediate a disagreement between welders and supervisors. The discussions were tense, but eventually resolved, reflecting a new understanding. The war had altered not only production, but social dynamics, creating space for negotiation and acknowledgement of workers' rights. African Americans, women, and other minorities continued to press forward, their wartime roles cementing new expectations for post-war society. Ruth, now a nurse in a bustling military hospital, had earned recognition for her tireless work with wounded soldiers. She had seen firsthand the contributions of people who had long been marginalized, and she understood that the war had accelerated social change in ways that would ripple for decades. Across the country, the participation of women and minorities in previously restricted roles had demonstrated competence and resilience that could not be ignored, laying the groundwork for the movements and reforms that would follow. When the news of Hitler's death reached American homes, there were quiet celebrations. Radios crackled with reports of liberation, Allied advances, and the promise of peace in Europe. Families embraced in living rooms, tears and laughter mingling, while factory whistles sounded a symbolic triumph, even as the machines continued to hum. Mary and her co-workers stepped outside, the night air filled with cheers, the sound of children laughing, and neighbors calling greetings across streets. The tension that had defined the past 4 years lifted, replaced by the exhilaration of collective achievement and relief. In the weeks that followed, news of Japan's surrender spread, and the nation erupted in jubilant celebration. Streets overflowed with people waving flags, marching in spontaneous parades and lighting bonfires. Mary found herself swept into the crowd, clutching her gloves and a friend's arm, her heart pounding with a mixture of exhaustion and joy. She thought of the sacrifices, the long shifts, rationed meals, and scrimped resources, and realized that this moment of victory was as much theirs as that of the soldiers who had fought abroad. The home front had fought a war of its own, and now it could breathe. Yet even amid celebration, Americans began to reflect on the changes wrought by these years. Neighborhoods had shifted, communities had strengthened, and ordinary citizens had discovered capacities they had never imagined. Women like Mary and Ruth had proven themselves in roles traditionally denied to them, while men who had remained at home had learned the importance of cooperation, resourcefulness, and flexibility. Minority communities had demanded recognition and opportunity, and although inequities remained, the precedent had been set. Society could no longer ignore the contributions of anyone willing and able to serve. The ration books were slowly retired, but the lessons of conservation and planning endured. Families looked back on years of ingenuity with pride, from victory gardens to creatively stretched meals, from scrap collection drives to bond rallies. Schools began to teach about the home front, about the extraordinary mobilization of ordinary citizens, and about the ways that collective action had influenced the outcome of the war. Children who had collected tin and rubber now carried memories of participation in something larger than themselves, memories that would shape their values and perspectives for decades to come. By the fall of 1945, as factories returned to peacetime production and soldiers returned home, the United States had changed irrevocably. The home front had been transformed into a hub of innovation, collaboration, and civic responsibility. Families had sacrificed, laborers had organized, women had entered the workforce in new and permanent ways, and communities had come together to meet a national crisis. The war had demanded everything, and Americans had given it willingly, proving that heroism did not always reside on the battlefield. Sometimes it lived in kitchens, factories, offices, and neighborhoods, shaping the course of history in quiet but profound ways. Mary, Henry, Ruth, and millions of others reflected on the years with a sense of accomplishment. They had endured rationing, fatigue, social tension, and constant uncertainty, yet they had emerged resilient and transformed. Their labor, ingenuity, and sacrifice had supported soldiers, fueled production, and ultimately helped secure victory. The war had left scars and memories, but it had also created a society more united, more capable, and more aware of the strength found in collective action. As the sun set over American cities, the streets slowly emptied after the last parades. Factories went silent, gardens thrived, and families settled back into routines forever altered by the war. Yet the spirit of the home front, the courage, sacrifice, and creativity of ordinary citizens remained, a testament to what a nation could achieve when faced with unprecedented challenge. Victory had been won not only abroad but at home, and the lessons of those years would endure for generations, shaping the United States long after the guns fell silent. The months following Japan's surrender were filled with a mixture of relief, reflection, and anticipation of a new era. Streets that had erupted in spontaneous celebration slowly returned to daily routines, though the echoes of victory lingered in the air. Factories that had produced tanks, planes, and munitions began the long process of conversion back to consumer goods. Mary Thompson walked past the once roaring assembly lines, now quieting down, feeling a mix of pride and melancholy. She had spent 4 years shaping machines of war, her hands skilled in welding and stamping steel, her mind trained in precision and speed. Now, the work would shift, but the lessons of endurance, skill, and teamwork would remain with her forever. Society itself had changed. Women who had proven themselves indispensable in factories and shipyards now faced new choices: return to domestic life, continue careers, or pursue education and opportunities previously unavailable. Mary, like countless others, had discovered capabilities she had never imagined and a sense of independence that reshaped her expectations for her own life. Communities that had worked together through rationing, scrap drives, and bond campaigns had strengthened social bonds that would last long after the war. People had learned that ordinary individuals, united by purpose, could achieve extraordinary outcomes. For minority communities, the war years had been both a trial and a revelation. African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and other marginalized groups had contributed in vital ways to production, logistics, and health care. Figures like Ruth, now a respected nurse, reflected on the paradox, fighting for freedom abroad while facing prejudice at home. Yet, the home front had opened doors that would never close entirely, laying the groundwork for the civil rights struggles that would follow in the coming decades. The war had accelerated the conversation about equality, opportunity, and the nation's obligations to all its citizens. Children carried forward lessons that were not taught in textbooks, but learned in neighborhoods and homes. They remembered collecting scrap, tending gardens, and conserving resources. They had seen firsthand the impact of collective effort, of every small action contributing to a larger victory. These lessons shaped a generation that valued civic responsibility, ingenuity, and resilience, a generation aware that freedom required participation and sacrifice, both on the battlefield and at home. Labor relations had evolved as well. Strikes and negotiations during the war had taught workers and employers the importance of dialogue, fairness, and recognition of contribution. The home front had been a crucible for the modern labor movement, demonstrating that collective action could coexist with national unity, and that the economy could be mobilized for both war and post-war growth. Factories now shifted toward peacetime production, but the organizational skills, technological advances, and workforce dynamics developed during the war would fuel prosperity in the decades to come. Victory had been won not only on distant beaches and in battlefields far from home, but in kitchens, offices, and factory floors across the nation. Mary thought of the countless neighbors, friends, and colleagues whose contributions had been invisible yet vital. The woman operating a press, the man delivering supplies, the child collecting tin, the mother stretching rationed meals. Each act, small or large, had been a thread in the vast tapestry of national effort, a testament to the idea that ordinary people could shape history through courage, ingenuity, and determination. As the first post-war holidays approached, families celebrated not just the end of conflict, but the enduring spirit that had carried them through years of scarcity, anxiety, and relentless labor. They shared meals, stories, and laughter, honoring both those who had fought abroad and those who had sustained the nation at home. The home front had proven that heroism was not confined to soldiers in uniform. It lived in the quiet courage of citizens who had risen to meet unprecedented challenges with resilience and creativity. Mary walked through her neighborhood one evening, the streets bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. Children played in yards that had once been victory gardens, neighbors chatted on porches, and the hum of returning normalcy filled the air. Yet beneath the surface of ordinary life, the lessons of the war endured. That sacrifice mattered, that cooperation could overcome hardship, and that a nation's strength lay not only in its armies, but in its people. She felt a quiet pride, knowing that she had been part of something larger than herself, a movement that had shaped the nation and preserved freedom. Henry Rodriguez, Ruth, and countless others shared similar reflections. The war had demanded everything from them, and they had given it willingly. In return, they had gained something enduring: confidence, skill, community, and a sense of agency that would continue to influence their lives and society long after the guns fell silent. They had transformed the home front into a battlefield of intellect, effort, and perseverance, and in doing so, they had altered the course of history. The United States emerged from the war changed, forged in the fires of mobilization, rationing, and collective effort. Its citizens had learned that resilience, innovation, and unity could achieve the extraordinary. Factories, farms, and neighborhoods had become instruments of national purpose, proving that the contributions of every citizen, women, men, children, Minorities were vital to the nation's survival and success. The home front had been more than a backdrop to war. It had been a battleground, a proving ground, and a crucible that transformed ordinary lives into extraordinary legacies. And so, as peace settled over the country, Americans looked to the future with lessons learned and spirits strengthened. The war had tested them in ways unimaginable, yet it had also revealed the boundless capacity of a nation and its people to endure, adapt, and triumph. In kitchens, classrooms, factories, and streets, the story of the home front lived on, a testament to courage, sacrifice, ingenuity, and the quiet heroism of millions who had fought a war without leaving home, yet whose contributions shaped the destiny of a nation and the world. By the end of 1945, the country had quieted, but the echoes of effort, sacrifice, and resilience remained woven into every street, factory, and home. Factories that had once roared with the urgency of war now shifted back to peacetime production. Yet the skills, discipline, and innovation cultivated during the conflict endured. Mary Thompson walked past the stamping presses one last time, pausing to run her fingers over the steel she had welded. She thought of the thousands of tanks, planes, and munitions that had left these floors, of the lives those machines had helped protect, and of the invisible web of citizens whose work had made victory possible. Neighborhoods, once buzzing with ration drives, scrap collections, and bond campaigns, settled into a new rhythm. Victory gardens remained, a symbol of ingenuity and perseverance, and families carried forward lessons of resourcefulness and collaboration. Children, who had grown up amidst ration books and scrap drives, now returned to schools that slowly shifted back to normal. Yet the memory of contribution lingered in their minds. They had learned that ordinary people, when united by purpose, could shape history as much as soldiers on distant battlefields. Women like Mary and Ruth faced new choices, their wartime contributions having transformed expectations. Many returned to domestic life, yet countless others continued careers in offices, factories, and healthcare, asserting newfound independence and capability. Minority communities, too, had claimed roles and recognition previously denied, laying the foundations for the civil rights movements that would sweep the nation in the decades ahead. The war had opened doors, challenged traditions, and reshaped society in profound ways. Letters from soldiers returned home, recounting not only battles, but the knowledge that the home front had sustained them. Mothers, fathers, and teenagers who had rationed, labored, and volunteered saw themselves reflected in the triumphs of liberation and peace. Every meal stretched, every hour at the factory, every scrap collected had been part of a larger effort, one that had preserved freedom, defended democracy, and demonstrated the power of collective action. As Mary walked through her neighborhood one crisp autumn evening, she watched children play in yards once used for gardens, neighbors chatting on porches, and families carrying on with daily routines forever altered by the war. She felt pride, humility, and a deep sense of purpose, knowing that she had been part of a generation that had met the greatest challenge of its time. Across the country, millions shared that sentiment, quietly aware that they had done extraordinary things, often without recognition, simply by answering the call in kitchens, classrooms, factories, and streets. The United States had emerged from the war transformed. The home front had proven that courage, ingenuity, and sacrifice were not confined to soldiers or battlefields. They lived in the actions of ordinary citizens willing to endure hardship and work tirelessly for a greater cause. Society had changed irrevocably. Gender roles, labor relations, and racial dynamics had been reshaped. Communities had grown stronger, and a new understanding of national responsibility had taken root. The legacy of the home front endured, a reminder that heroism often resided not in fame or medals, but in sustained effort, creativity, and resilience. The story of Mary, Henry, Ruth, and millions of others reflected a quiet but enduring triumph. that when a nation united its citizens in purpose, even ordinary lives could leave extraordinary marks on history. And so, as the lights dimmed in factories and neighborhoods settled into post-war calm, the spirit of the home front remained, a testament to sacrifice, ingenuity, and the enduring power of collective courage. Americans had fought a war at home and abroad, and in doing so, had transformed their society, their country, and the course of history itself.